ghosts of Sydney's convict past hover across our city to remind us of the penal transportation system which saw over 160,000 men, women and children transplanted to Australian shores. Approximately half were destined to Sydney. Apart from the dubious legality of taking the land from the Indigenous people without a thought of treaty, the British set to building the first colonial settlement on prime Gadigal land, using bitter, hard sweat of convict labour.
On arrival, the majority of First Fleet convicts were released to fend for themselves, to build rudimentary shelter in the area now known as the Rocks. The system didn't care less whether they returned or not. Good riddance to bad rubbish. But the authorities knew the terrified and hungry convicts would return next morning, and they did. The plan was to build a settlement, in effect a jail town, which would cope with successive arrivals of transports. Convicts were set to work, men, yoked together like cattle, forged through the wild bushland to turn tracks to roads. Gangs in heavy leg irons smashed sandstone to make bricks, and men, skilled or otherwise, laboured to create buildings great and small. Some convict-built buildings remain to remind us of our past, including the Hyde Park Barracks, the Macquarie Street Mint, St James's Church, and the Rum Hospital, which is now part, maybe appropriately, of State Parliament. Labouring under the crack of the whip was fraught with danger, hydration, snakes and spiders, exhaustion, and unforeseen danger. Treated as slave labour, the men were often deprived of adequate food and proper accommodation. They were expendable. More convict ships were always in transit. Later convict arrivals also sweated to carve the impressive Argyle Cut passageway between the rocky peninsula separating the harbour and Millers Point. And across the bay, convicts turned Cockatoo Island, called Warima by the local Indigenous people, into a convict prison and grain depot, and later our first colonial shipyard dry dock. John Cadman's cottage, constructed in 1816 for use by coxswains and ships' crews, has the distinction of being the first building to be erected on the shoreline of the Rocks area and is the oldest surviving Sydney residence. For the convict class, many who had been incarcerated for years in rotting hulk floating prisons on the Thames, or, just as bad, were residents of notorious institutions like Newgate Jail or the Bedlam Asylum for the insane, and if they survived the torturous sea journey, they found the fresh air, sunshine and physical labour a fortunate turn of fate. Apart from the aching loneliness and thoughts of separation from loved ones, their lives were generally healthier, and of course there was always the hope of eventual freedom. Not that return tickets were readily provided by the system. Physical retribution against their oppressors was impossible, so songs were often used as vehicles for sarcasm and in their own simplistic way captured the essence of the times. One song, simply known as Botany Bay, a new song, pointed to why convicts were transported and reinforced Governor Macquarie's later remark, Australia was settled by people sentenced here and those who should have been.
The hulks and the jails have thousands in store, but out of the jail are 10,000 times more, who live by fraud, cheating, vile tricks and foul play, and should all be sent over to Botany Bay.
Around 13,000 women were sentenced to Australia. There were also children, some as young as 9 years of age, sentenced to transportation, usually for petty thievery. On arrival, women and children were expected to work. The women and young girls were dispatched to the female factory at Parramatta, where they worked in laundries and fabric repair, or were dispatched as indentured farm workers. Some women, by good fortune or bad luck, were married off to settlers. On Thursdays, at the factory, a parade was held. Settlers could choose a wife, and if she agreed, off they'd go to start a new life. The story of Francis McNamara, better known as Frank the Poet, is both colourful and dark. Sentenced at 21 for stealing plaid, he was sent to Sydney for 7 years. Arriving on the ship Eliza, the self-proclaimed poet appears to have almost immediately stepped on the toes of the system. Being an Irishman, McNamara saw the British as no friend to Ireland, and he proved to be a difficult prisoner with a loud mouth. A year after arrival, he was transferred from the old Sydney jail to the Phoenix Hulk, a floating prison ship moored in Sydney Harbour, somewhere close to hell.
Now the soldiers they stand with their whips in their hands. They drive us like horses to plough up the land. You should see us poor fellows working in the jail yard. How hard is our fate in Australia.
Over his years in Sydney, Frank absconded and was recaptured 3 times. Records show he destroyed a government cart, stole a shirt, disobeyed orders, refused to work, neglected his work, and generally used obscene language and displayed insubordinate behaviour. Over 9 years he was sentenced to 2 years in leg irons, receiving a staggering 616 lashes of the cat o' nine tails and 3 months on the Sydney treadmill. There were 2 treadmills at Carter's Barracks. Erected in 1823, they were in use for 25 years. Essentially, prisoners walked continuous steps which turned the wheel to grind grain. It was demoralising and exhausting work. The larger wheel had 36 men at a time, 18 each side. The days were tortuously long, interrupted by 20-minute rest breaks. The convicts jokingly referred to them as their dancing academy. If sentenced to 50 lashes of the cat o' nine tail, a savage whip which could render a man's back to bloodied jelly, the convicts declared they were getting a new red shirt. The laconic Australian sense of humour was no doubt born in these harsh times. There was only defiance to be found in the story of Patrick Galvin, a young convict who in 1800 was sentenced to 300 lashes of the cat. After 100 across his back, 100 across his rump, and another 100 across his legs, his skin was reduced to bloodied red jelly. The account, by a witness, Joseph Holt, states Galvin did not utter a sound. When he was removed from the triangle, he spat in the face of his flogger, declaring, "You couldn't hit hard enough to harm a butterfly." In 1842, Frank McNamara escaped custody again and sentenced to life to Van Diemen's Land. He spent 3 months on Cockatoo Island before eventually being shipped to Port Arthur. 7 years later, he was granted a ticket of freedom. The extraordinary thing about Frank's life was not his tenacity, but his poetry, including the ballad of Bold Jack Donahue and the fantasizing Convict'S Tour of Hell, which finds Frank, the poet, in dialogue with Satan and witness to the torture of his many oppressors. By a miracle, these literary works survive. Convicts dreamt of salvation, of freedom, and although their treatment was harsh, the system worked in their favour, with many enduring their sentences and gaining their ticket of leave. If they were well behaved, they were not usually required to serve out their full term and could apply for a ticket of leave, a certificate of freedom, a conditional pardon, or an absolute pardon. With good conduct, a convict serving a 7-year term usually qualified for a ticket of leave after 4 or 5 years, whilst those serving 14 years could expect to serve between 6 to 8 years. Lifers could qualify for their conditional pardon after 10 or 12 years. Of the First Fleet's 778 convicts, a surprising 650 were granted freedom after 5 years. Many freed convicts became successful and respected citizens and silently carried their past with them. In the Australian bush, it was an unwritten law that you never asked anyone where they came from, in case they carried the convict stain. Although Sydney's convict era left a catalogue of architectural heritage, the system's most important legacy are the millions of Australians who claim convict ancestry. It is estimated 20% of our population, that's over 4 million of us, proudly carry the convict stain.